Welcome, everybody. My name's Kyle with Aeromotive. Chances are I know most of you. Kind of weird for me. Normally when I do this, I get to see your faces and encourage questions on the front side. That keeps me somewhat on track. But so a little different doing it this way. But very glad to have the opportunity. Obviously, these are trying times or different times, certainly. And if not trying, just pretty unique, at least in my 29 years on this planet. But typically when we come see you, we talk more about, or basically we present it like, hey, it's our chance to bring the SEMA show to you or the PRI show to you. And in doing that, we focus a lot on new product, but we also talk about just general fuel system science, the physics of fuel systems. And we'll do both those today. And then traditionally, we also talk about our legacy product. I'll often go back to our A1000 and talk, about how that's improved over the 25 years. It's a quite a bit different product than it was in 1994. But what we're doing differently this time around is rather than focus on the whole line, we're just taking segments of the product line and focusing there, doing a little bit deeper dive, but also just kind of an update. And today our topic is our brushless fuel pumps and some of the control strategies we've seen customers using with those products. Our brushless history, even though lately it's been defined by our 10 gallon a minute, our 7 gallon a minute, a year ago our 3.5 and our 5 gallon a minute. Our brushless side of that product line actually started with our diesel lift pump several years ago, and then we, from that standpoint, we were really able to appreciate the durability of it. We looked at that segment and thought, what would a diesel truck owner expect from a diesel lift pump in terms of durability and reliability, and along the way, we were able to take advantage of the reduction in amperage draw, which when the second generation of our experience with the engineering team came around was when NHRA mandated EFI for pro stock. And at the time, part of the rules package was 100 PSI maximum pressure. That was their mandate. And early on, it seemed like everybody was going to run 100 PSI. And so in a pretty short time frame, as you guys recall, the engineering team started integrating brushless technology into what was basically our Eliminator at the time, a roller vane pump. So shared that a little bit with our 230 gallon per hour diesel lift pump as well. And that's when, at least me personally, really came to appreciate the reduction in amperage draw at higher pressures, where it really starts to shine. And not only amperage reduction, but the amount of heat that we can take out of the fuel system. So that's kind of the early history of that part of the brushless product line. So as obviously there's a couple trends in our industry that are inescapable. It's very easy now to make 1,000 horsepower, 1,500 horsepower, 1,800 horsepower, numbers like that. And what ends up, and then the second element that I need to address is just alternative fuels, primarily E85. And you guys know from sitting in on these before, it takes 30% more E85 to make the same amount of horsepower as it does a gallon of gasoline. On top of that, you've got, what I would say is an increasing use of methanol. And we're not talking just about race cars. We're primarily focused on the dual purpose cars. I always refer to them as like a drag week car. Something's going to, at some point there may be a need to drive, 150, 200 miles and then, snap off a 6-second run or 7-second run or something like that, or apparently even a 5-second run now. So you take all those elements together and just the size of that market, and when I think back on it, Steve's initial goal of building a continuous duty fuel pump that would support 1,000 1,000 horsepower on the street. 1994, those cars were unicorns. They didn't exist. But as I mentioned before, you jump forward to the times we live in now, and honestly, there's people buying, building, driving those cars that they didn't progress to that level. They just kind of dove in at that end. So that being said, that type of market is way bigger than it used to be. So as a manufacturer, gave us the incentive, if you will, to spend dollars on R&D, to develop these kind of products. And so early on, we had, you know, brushless A1000 for what the NHRA cars were running. We had, with our acquisition of Waterman, we had access to various Spur Gear components of all different sizes. And one of the things we learned, though, at 100 PSI, the roller vane pump configuration at 100 PSI, it has its challenges. And that's true of all pumping mechanisms. You know, later today, when we're talking about our Phantom and our Gen 2 tanks and stuff like that, you'll hear me talk about the benefits of a turbine style pumping mechanism. Today, we'll talk about the advantages of both a roller vane and a Spur Gear. I think we use 6 different pumping mechanisms. All of them have advantages. All of them have a disadvantage. They're all a compromise at some level. But at 100 PSI, we saw pretty quickly that the roller vane had some challenges. And one other element in that. So you have the alternative fuels, continuous duty aspect, huge horsepower levels, so you need big flow. And then, you know, with alternative fuels, but also higher pressures. You know, we were accustomed to the, you know, the LS driven market, you know, seeing a 58 PSI base pressure. That wasn't a big deal. But the second element of that was the boost values kept going up and up and up. And, you know, if you're starting at a 58 PSI base and you're making, you know, 30 pounds of boost, 40 pounds of boost, you're getting over 100 really, really quickly. So through our testing, we were able to, in our early work with the Spur Gear, see some real upside in the sense that that flow curve stays much more linear. I'm going to jump to a slide and then I'll come back here just so that makes the conversation make a little bit more sense. So when you're looking at this flow graph, you'll see the 5 gallon a minute and 3.5. Those are both Spur Gear assemblies, and you'll see how linear that stays out there on the far right-hand side of the graph. That's 100 PSI. You'll notice the 2 roller vane pumps, the A1000 on the bottom, the Eliminator just above that. Get around 80 and you start to see some droop, particularly in the A1000. That could be a combination of motor efficiency and you know, the pumping mechanism, but I really want to point out the linearity of the Spur Gear assemblies, and that stayed true with the 7 gallon a minute and the 10 gallon a minute as well. So that being said, when we ended up at those higher pressures, it was clear that was one of the benefits of that Spur Gear assembly. I'll back up now and just kind of talk about how we pull this program together. So you guys that have been following us for a while, you know that there's a lot of different ways you can buy this product. You can get the external inline that's just a sleeve. That product now ships with stainless steel T-bolt clamps. So that consumer might build a little saddle and clamp it in there, may use the stainless clamps in a number of different ways. You can get it in a complete fuel cell. We have 5, 15, and 20 gallon, or I'm sorry, 6, 15, and 20 gallon fuel cells. The 15 and the 20 come with a fuel level sending unit installed. And I say that just once again, a lot of these vehicles are street driven. If you already have a Aeromotive cell, we have a 10-inch drop-in assembly that's pictured on the left side of the screen there. In addition to that, we have that assembly, but in what we call universal, that basically takes that foot filter and you can extend it down. So, and wait, there's actually another option. We have what we call our signature sleeve that has the mounting feet integrated. Obviously, you know, that's a big part of Aeromotive's brand identity is that sleeve. So a lot of different ways to buy the product. And that is true through the A1000 on up to the 10 gallon a minute. And I'm going to leave this up here for just a second, just so that you can identify what a Spur Gear is. It occurred to me doing these over the years that not everybody understands or can visualize the difference between a roller vane, a turbine, a G-rotor, a Spur Gear, a sliding vane on down the line. So I think I'm going to make a note to myself at some point to just put a single slide together that has all those different pumping mechanisms on there, so that at least I can hand that visual cue off to you guys. So I'll make a note to myself on that. So I mentioned the 3.5 and the 5. You know, just kind of a side note on this, the progression of the 6 gallon cell really started out when we were doing the Cobra Jet Copo drag pack factory supercars. And as those cars have progressed, the early Cobra jets actually had an inline A1000. It's got to the point now where, particularly in the COPO program, the upgrade for those cars is now a 3.5 gallon a minute in that 6 gallon cell. So that'll tell you a little bit about what the factory is able to deliver in terms of performance and how Aeromotive as a company has been able to respond to those ever increasing horsepower levels. So, I want to touch on A1000 and Eliminator a little bit. So we've had, obviously you can still buy a conventional brushed 11101, 11104, and all the in-tank variants of those. So that's conventional. It's a brush type assembly. We've had the brushless versions of both those for quite some time now. Just about a month ago, I think February, we released the true variable speed versions of the A1000 and the Eliminator. And just to give you a little bit insight into why those products lagged the Spur Gear, we figured out pretty early on that the way we use that controller just wasn't always in harmony with the roller vane configuration in those two pumps. So it took a little bit extra time for the engineers to develop what became the true variable speed A1000 Eliminator. Same principles apply. After sitting on the tech lines the past couple of weeks, it's nice to see that I think the consumer, the enthusiast, has come to appreciate the value of our billet pump speed controller that we've had on the market for years and years now. Been through several versions of it. The nice part of this, having the true variable speed controller built into the pump, is that we can do that with one assembly, and frankly, quite a bit easier, I think, to install for the consumer to, fully appreciate. But the knowledge is out there of the benefits of slowing the cycle rate down. And across this line, typically the low side in our true variable speed pumps is about 30%, maybe a little bit less than that of full volume. And you guys know, you've heard me say it 100 times, that the advantage of that is, especially in this pump gas environment, but true with any fuel, but especially true with pump gas, when you put any fuel under a vacuum, you drop the boiling point. And so, with any external pump, that's absolutely true. That's not unique to Aeromotive, not unique to the A1000 or the Eliminator. True of it's just physics. So when we put fuel under a vacuum, that's why, as the last OE went in tank in 1986. So every day after that, if you're a fuel blender, if you're the guy responsible for the fuel at your Casey's or your Quick Trip or something like that, you don't give a dang about external fuel pump. And so through our history, what we learned is that, if we're able to right size that fuel pump, if you need an external pump in particular, but in tank as well, if you can right size that fuel pump for your driving conditions, everybody's better off because there's less vacuum signal, the cycle rate's less, fuel stays cooler because you aren't, if you have a 15-gallon tank and that 3 gallon a minute pump, that tank's only full until you start the car. But even at that point, you're cycling that fuel every 5 minutes. You get down to a half a tank, you're cycling it every 2.5 minutes. So if we can reduce that by 70%, you just do the math. There's just huge benefits in being able to control the speed or the cycle rate of the system. And that's where true variable speed comes in, including the A1000 and the Eliminator, but especially true with these bigger pumps. So let me back up here just a moment, grab a little drink of water. So, we start out kind of talking about 7 and 10 gallon a minute. They are available only with true variable speed. So up to 5 gallon a minute, you can get either brushless or true variable speed brushless. We don't have a brush, a conventional style 3.5 or 5, only available brushless or true variable speed. Then 7 and 10 gallon a minute is only true variable speed. The reason being is just what we were talking about here. That is, these pumps are so large that unless it's just a drag only car, it'd be foolish to try to sell or expect the consumer to have a good experience with that 7 or 10 gallon a minute. And that 10 gallon a minute, you think about it, I mean, even at 30%, it's still moving, 3 gallons a minute. And so you're in the territory of an Eliminator at full throat the whole time. So I mean, that's still an awful lot of fuel, regardless of, how much power the car makes. So on that true variable speed, one of the things that has become, well, I want to back up just a little bit. Look at the horsepower values on these things. I mean, they are just staggering when you look at it. I mean, we're at 3,400 pounds on E85 forced induction on that 10 gallon a minute pump. That's an awful lot of horsepower. But, as we mentioned before, with engine technology, turbo technology, centrifugal supercharger technology, where it's at, it's pretty easy to do, or it's not easy to do, but it's way more common than it was, 5 or 10 years ago. And we want to be able to serve that customer, but we want to be able to serve that customer with the best product we can. One thing unique about our true variable speed is I think the enthusiast is accustomed to what the OEs do with pulse width modulation with PWM. We don't do it that way. And I think our engineering team saw a benefit in using a 0 to 5 volt analog signal that I think as a company, we're just coming to appreciate. As you guys know, Aeromotive is not afraid to take the path least taken, if you will. And this is kind of one of those areas where we did that, and now starting, I think, to appreciate the benefits. That being said, early on, I think especially when we got into these two big products, most of our conversations centered around how we would use TPS, throttle position sensor, to control these big pumps. And probably goes back to what we did early on with our pump speed controller, but even it reminds me of a kind of an interactive display we had at PRI one year where we took a belt drive pump. I think we're one of the absolute first, if not the first, to use a belt drive pump, G-rotor in that case, for an EFI application. And through, what our 13113 regulator, we were able to make that variable speed pump act like a steady state pump, or, just like an electric pump. So we learned a lot about how to capitalize on these different combinations of things. And I think that's true as well as what we've done here with our control strategies, if you will, on these bigger pumps. So once again, just look at the linearity of those flow curves as they go up in pressure. It's a beautiful thing to see. And on the 10 gallon a minute, just because it's in such a high demand device, it's one of the reasons, if you read the instructions there, you'll notice that we impose some limits on the high side pressure on that. Not necessarily true on the 3.5, 5, and 7 gallon a minute. And we're going to jump to the instructions here in just a moment, because I think it's really telling about how serious these pieces are. Don't want to lose sight of this. So they plumb in a very conventional way. That's a 5 gallon a minute. If you go on aeromotiveinc.com, you will find power planners for all the products, for a variety. I mean, you'll see them for EFI, for nitrous, for, carbureted, all different applications. But the one thing I really want you to pay attention to when you're looking at these is how it's changed the plumbing schematic. I mean, it's getting where the return line, I think on the 10 gallon a minute, if I remember right, it's a -12 line. It wasn't all that long ago where you didn't see much bigger than -6 or -8 in our power planners for return line and EFI application. Now we're up to a 12. So it tells you a little bit about how the market's changed. So I kind of started talking about strategies there a little bit. Early on, most of our focus when we were engaged with consumers was, using TPS signal. And I think a couple things have happened along that time. We saw more of the installer base using other strategies other than TPS, and came to understand that there was some resistance out there because consumers had bad experience when they picked up a TPS signal with trans controller or something like that. So there are what are known as breakout harnesses out there. TCI has a piece, part number 377200, 377200. Inexpensive piece. You're not breaking into the OE harness. Makes it really clean. Most of us are not wiring savvy enough to feel comfortable sometimes breaking apart and depinning some of these things if you're doing a lot of it. But in our instructions, there's actually 4 different modes, mode 1 through 4, that lay out different strategies on how you can do this. And what I came to find is that those were employed way more often than guys using TPS. Part of that question, I think, was driven by our language, how we express this was always about a 0 to 5 volt input off the TPS. The controller itself can take up to 16 volts. That's not a problem. So what I'd learned was that a lot of guys were just switching the control side, or the controller itself. It's a 3-wire controller. The conventional brushless stuff is just 2 wires. So how you can tell the difference is the true variable speed is a 3-wire, conventional brushless is a 2-wire. They were just switching the controller with 12 volts or taking it away. And if you look at mode 1 through 4, you'll kind of see how this plays out. I'm going to jump there in just a second. The one thing I want to leave again, I know I said it before, is you don't use a pulse width modulation as a control strategy on any of the Aeromotive brushless pumps. So I'm at the risk of needing my IT department. I'm going to jump to the instructions now and see if we can make this happen correctly. Let's see. How's everybody doing? Everybody still there?
You still have it, at least.
It's what?
You're still good.
Still good? Okay. So so this is on aeromotiveinc.com, obviously. I want to point out a couple things here too, just kind of common sense stuff. But when you get, one thing I want to emphasize, when you start getting into these really big pumps like that, we need to start thinking about everything. You'll see in here, we mandate at least a 1/2 inch vent. That's probably something we need to look at in our own cells. I guess we are a -8 vent in our cells. So we're covered there, but all of a sudden everything matters when you get into these really big pumps. So here's the language I was talking about on the, continuous operating pressure shouldn't exceed 90 PSI, shouldn't exceed 125 PSI. Those are just safety limits our engineers want to put in place. There's some flexibility there. I'm sales marketing guy, so I'm always looking for flexibility on that kind of stuff. The other thing I want to point out is the wiring requirements for these big pumps, and this is just meant to be kind of directional. Our 16306 wiring kit is a great piece. I mean, a really good piece, high quality wire. But when you start looking at these pumps, you'll notice that's calling for a dash or a gauge, 6-gauge wire. We're not that far away from almost being a small battery cable at some point. So 6-gauge wire, you'll notice the 60 amp relay. These things, demand is really, really high. And that's one of the reasons I want you to think always in the terms of employing some kind of a strategy to where you're able to take advantage of the true variable speed. Just to give you an example, at the low speed at 30% or high 20s, we're down to about 3 gallons a minute. Amperage draw on the 10 gallon a minute is 13 amps. By the time we're at 60 PSI, so by the time we're at, let's say, base pressure in a conventional LS combo, we're at 48. Those numbers for the 7 gallon a minute at the bottom side, we're at 8.7. At 60 PSI, we're at 29 amps. Obviously, what we're trying to do there is in these dual purpose vehicles is use that cycle rate to slow down flow, reduce amperage draw, minimize the amount of heat we're putting in the fuel. We're putting a lot less heat in the fuel, if we're on that low side and 13 amps. Doesn't matter if we're driving up to the starting line, driving through the pits, driving back from a run, or if we're driving between, Kansas City and St. Louis on drag week someday. Hopefully they bring it back to our neighborhood here one of these days. So when you take all those factors at play, I think you really start to appreciate the benefit of the true variable speed and how to make it work. And I'm starting to understand more how the consumers are thinking of it. I had a young guy on tech line the other day, had a little 4G 63, 65 pounds of boost, and his base pressure is in the 40s somewhere. So making a ton of power, but a little 2-liter engine. And as we were talking through the different control strategies, he said, look, this thing's so high RPM that he said, if I'm driving back from a run, he said, I don't want to hear the pump RPM picking up and down, because you're going to hear the Spur Gear pumps are fairly loud. They're not going to be whisper quiet like a turbine style mechanism, going back to when we were talking about advantages, disadvantages. That being said, that was some insight I hadn't really thought about, and it was just the relative RPM or the range, the amount of tip in. And so one of the strategies he employed, or that he's going to employ, and this is back where I was talking through mode 1 through 4. Mode 1, we're primarily looking at TPS or some similar signal to where you're going to create a bit of a curve. What I'm seeing more common is these other strategies to where we just have a low side and a high side, basically a 2-speed. And you'll see there, we have constant full speed, so you're switching all different kinds of switch strategies, not control strategies on that side, switch strategies to where you're constant full speed and you slow the pump down when you're driving from Kansas City to St. Louis. The other side of that, it's just the opposite. You're constant low speed and you flip to a high speed strategy, high flow strategy. Once again, the same, just the inverse. and then mode 4, just kind of rolls everything together there. Once again, you're not going to see a curve as much as you're just going to see a step. Had one of our distributors tell me, he said, you know what? He said, I see the advantage of TPS in a 4 or 6, maybe an 800 horsepower car, because it's kind of what that consumer is more used to, and in a sense of it almost emulates a PWM strategy. He said, but when you're 12, 1800, 2000 horsepower, these big numbers, he said, none of that appeals to us. He said, we just know we need to get into the, 100% flow early, and Brett, one of our senior tech guys, has a good line. He said, boost is never going to be quicker than TPS, if you will. The boost curve is never going to out accelerate what we can do with the accelerator. And I agree with that. So this has come down to one of the reasons I'm glad we have a lot of choices is because I think from our A1000 with true variable speed to our 10 gallon a minute with true variable speed, we're covering all different types of vehicles, personalities, fuel choices, driving styles, just how the vehicle's used. And so it's nice to have these strategies and not try to cram everybody into the same box. So as we're talking to consumers about this, get them focused on what we're sharing here in the instructions. Everybody's going to find some kind of control strategy that they like, that fits their strategy, fits their vehicle, fits their application. So let's see. I'm going to mention this while it's here. It doesn't fit necessarily to the brushless stuff or specifically, but engineering team's been adding some of this troubleshooting stuff on in the instructions. I take a lot of pride in our instructions. We threw in a tech bulletin here on filtration, obviously, because these great big pumps, that suction side filter becomes very, very important. Actually, both of them do, not just the suction side. Let me jump back to the PowerPoint here. Looks like I'm getting a little tight on time, Jake.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't even realize it, but yes.
Let's see. So in we presented a version of this session yesterday. It was I think a practice run, as Jake figured out. But one of the things that became apparent in leading up to yesterday's session and during the session was that, we get to this 10 gallon a minute. And if you would have told me at PRI 2018, we introduced the 3.5 and the 5 at SEMA 2018, got a ton of coverage on them at PRI 2018. But if you would have told me the first guy in line that saw that 5 gallon a minute, he said, I need to have it. The second guy in line, he said, cool, but I really need 7 gallon a minute. That's how quick this market has changed. And thankfully how we've been able to respond to it and quickly as well. So introduced the 7 and 10 gallon a minute at PRI 2019. But in conversations with these guys, going back to the whole idea of alternative fuel usage becoming way more common and power levels are going way up, we see a lot of opportunity out there for our G-rotor and Spur Gear pumps as well. And with the acquisition of Waterman, who has kind of pioneered the cable drive technology that allows you to put these big pumps either in the fuel cell or back at the fuel cell at the back of the car, so they're pushing rather than pulling. Kind of brings us to this point. So just wanted to make you aware, we have these 6 and 12 gallon a minute G-rotor pumps on the Aeromotive side. We have 16 to 32 gallon a minute Spur Gear pumps on the Aeromotive side. Really good product line. Steve and the engineering team were able to start with a clean sheet of paper. This somehow coincided with Steve's pro mod career to where we started working on these big Spur Gear pumps, and but really high quality pumps. Just Aeromotive through and through. Wanted you to be aware of them, but also even like on the blow through carbureted side, we have seen that change so quickly in different categories that run blow through carbureted stuff to where where they used to get away with a 6 gallon a minute pump. Now those guys, 2 years later, they're at 12 gallon a minute. Had a guy on dyno a couple of weeks ago he had spent about a year and a half, engine builder, spent about a year and a half using the 12 gallon a minute for everything. All of a sudden now he's a 16 gallon a minute Spur Gear. So just wanted to give you some awareness of how that side of the world has changed, and that Aeromotive does in fact have a product to suit those needs. Let me open it up to questions. I'm going to scan my notes here real quick. There's some contact info. If you have questions you want to email, offline or give me a buzz or whatever you want. Jake, we got any questions from the folks?
Not yet.
Okay.
I had a couple questions. I know you talked about diesel earlier, and this is something that we get at shows and stuff like that. But diesel, methanol, E85 on them brushless pumps might be an easy question to answer, but it gets asked what seems like quite frequently.
Great question. Yeah, and you're right. I did skip over that. So, and I'll expand the question a little bit. So yeah, the brushless Spur Gear, gas E85 or whatever percentage ethanol, methanol. We might have some guys out there on diesel. They are very fuel friendly. The advantage and the brushless technology, there is some advantage in both ethanol and methanol. So if we're thinking back on a comparison between a brushless A1000 or Eliminator and a brush style in E85, that would be the durability of the brushless style would be better in an E85 environment. For the brushless would have an advantage in terms of durability over the brush style. I goofed that all up, but you guys know what I mean. And then, just further, that obviously carries all the way up the food chain. Have just been correcting lately. There was some confusion out there that our regulators were not diesel compatible. So had just been correcting that lately because a few catalogs ago we spec them as being diesel friendly, but somewhere along the way that got lost. So across the Aeromotive product line, we do I think a really good job of making sure fuel compatibility throughout the line. It's a key priority because we don't always know what the consumer's fueling their projects with, and then some of the products get used in industrial environments where they're not even put in vehicles. So yeah, you can use any fuel, particularly with the brushless Spur Gear.
Another question that I had also, I know that like in past, I've used like mystery oil and stuff like that in my cars, like towards the end of the season and stuff like that. Is there any issue with just a little cap full of that?
No, and we like your background a little bit on the dirt track side. So one of the things you run into there that we don't in other forms of motorsport is guys that pickle their systems between races or over the winter and stuff like that. And the one area I would caution you that if you're doing a filter disassembly, as part of that program, leave the O-rings on the filters dry. If we lube them up, they're going to swell up and you're going to end up replacing the O-ring probably every time you disassemble it. So that's one area I guess that comes to mind is just leave the O-ring dry and don't put those types of lubricants on the O-ring.
Definitely. You brought it up earlier, so I got to ask it. Are we allowed to, have we heard anything more? Are we allowed to bring up anything about diesel lift pumps and new stuff coming out yet?
Oh, you know where my heart's at in that, brother. So, our existing diesel lift pump product line, well engineered, probably overshot the retail price market a little bit. Where we've seen success with that is the 230. So we have a 130 gallon per hour version and 230. The 230, I think, found a home with the guys who were looking at running 2 or 3 of our competitors' units. So, when they start doing the math on, hey, if I got to buy 2 of this or 3 of this, and I can buy 1 Aeromotive and do a better job, honestly, just especially in terms of pressure control. What else can you say about that 2 micron cap filter? That speaks for itself. So that's where we've found some success. We've had some folks out in the field developing or using some of our in-tank solutions, if you will, in different ways. As of yet, we haven't committed to that, in terms of developing a whole new product line. The one thing I will mention that has been true, Aeromotive celebrated our 25th anniversary last August. When I go into diesel shops, I still see a lot of Aeromotive 11101s, A1000s, Eliminators, 11104, our automotive product, our conventional, bread and butter being used with our filters, regulators, pumps, filters, regulators in the diesel market. And as a company, it's tough to measure that because you just don't know. But there's been an awful lot of Aeromotive product that wasn't an engineered diesel lift pump used over the years. And I generally find that the guys that work in those shops, a lot of them were ex-Fox Body Mustang guys or something like that. So they knew the product. They knew our reputation. They appreciated our engineering excellence, and took that A1000 or that Eliminator and put it on their diesel hot rod.
For sure. One other question that I also had: serviceability of the brushless stuff. How do we do that? And is there service parts available, or do we just have to send it back to you?
Send them back, and one thing I want to start with, they're very, very durable. And as you know, we wet flow every pump that comes out of our facility, from the 200 liter per hour on up to the 10 gallon a minute, and obviously the 16 and 32 gallon a minute Spur Gear. I mean, once they're assembled, they go on a bench just to create the flow card that we provide to the customer. So if the consumer thinks they have something going on, one of the reasons we want the product to come back is that simple reason: we wet flow everything. That's the only way we can verify alignment of the bearings, the seal, everything is done right. And there's some of the sub-assemblies, they actually go on the bench. An A1000, for example, big T-style carbureted pump. It goes on the bench with the motor not locked down. It's semi-tight, if you will. And just by, we have a spec for amperage draw, flow at a given voltage. And you can play with that motor, create some alignment, and just by watching amperage draw, and you'll hear it too, there's actually an audible change when things are perfectly aligned, and we do that to lock it down. Obviously, we know the consumer can't do that, at home, and we feel an obligation to do that just to service the customers. So the easiest way to do that is just call in, ask for Enzo in warranty and repair, and he will give you an RGA number, return goods authorization. He will take address, phone number, just so that when he gets the product into service, he's already got that out of the way. But he also has a basic idea of what's going on with the product, just so that he can do a better job serving you as the enthusiast.
Awesome. I haven't seen any other questions come through, so if anybody else has anything, otherwise I think we're good to go.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate the help, brother.